After more than a decade of cutting the personal income tax, some Republican state lawmakers are proposing a bill that would phase it out completely, as well as what had been the state's chief business tax, the commercial activity tax. Based on current budget numbers, this would be a cut of around $13 billion. Last week, I spoke with one of the joint sponsors of the House version of that bill, freshman Republican Representative Adam Matthews. This week, another view of that idea from tax policy researcher Bailey Williams at the nonprofit left-leaning think tank Policy Matters Ohio. What should be the concerns about phasing out Ohio's state income tax?
Well, there are a couple major concerns that we at Policy Matters are at the forefront of our concern list. Is one, what this is going to mean for the budget. The commercial activity tax and the state income tax, they collectively make up about $13 billion of tax revenue. That's about 40 to 45% of all the revenue that the state gets in taxes. Where's the state going to make that up? We already have a property tax committee that is looking at potentially getting tax relief towards to more Ohioans. So between the income tax and the sales tax, if those are not going to be ways that we look at increasing tax revenue, we're looking at the sales tax, one of our most regressive taxes that we have on the books. Shifting the tax burden, if we're doing away with the income tax and shifting it towards the sales tax, we're really placing more of the tax burden on lower earning Ohioans, where the sales tax is going to eat up more of their annual income. Whereas with the income tax, we're putting that tax burden more on wealthier families. We're shifting again, if we're doing away with it and putting in the sales tax, shifting that the tax burden towards lowest earning Ohioans. The next biggest concern is, well, again, I'm sorry, it's the tax burden shift and what it means for the budget.
One of the claims is that this is centered on is that each time the state has reduced the state income tax, the personal income tax, from the peak in 1984 and which was 9 income tax brackets, I guess 9.5%, there's been an increase of revenue each time because they said when you have more economic activity coming into the state or staying in the state, that raises the revenue. Is that true?
Somewhat true. But again, we have to look at where we're placing that tax burden. Having most of our tax revenue coming in through that sales tax, which is the case now, most of our revenue does come in through the sales tax, we're placing a big burden on our lowest earning Ohioans, allowing that the current sales tax of the state about 5.75%. We're eating into lower incomes Ohioans' salaries and incomes a lot quicker than we would if we had an income tax placed on wealthier Ohioans, where lower earning Ohioans pay less. So placing that burden, we're still getting revenue, but placing that tax burden on lower earning Ohioans is kind of there's better ways to get the tax revenue that we need to operate as a state. Yeah,
in fact, you've described the state's tax system as upside down, with low and middle income families paying a far larger share of their income toward taxes than wealthy Ohioans do. Now, the sponsors say that they don't want to hurt low income Ohioans. People making just over $26,000 a year don't pay income tax right now, and there's no tax on food, there's no tax on baby items, they don't want to cut Medicaid. So could this work in a way that doesn't hurt low income Ohioans?
I haven't seen a way that this legislation playing out wouldn't hurt low-income Ohioans for two ways. Again, possibly shifting that lost revenue back, making up through the sales tax, and then potentially looking at service cuts that come with that lost revenue. Again, we're cutting potentially 40 to 45% of our revenue. Whereas Ohio has to have a balanced budget each time we do one every 2 years. So where is the spending going to be cut from, assuming we don't make up 100% of the revenue that we're losing? We're cutting Medicaid. They say they don't want to cut Medicaid. Are we looking at environmental protections? Are we looking at K-12 education? We have a ballooning line item expenditure through our voucher program that is taking up a vastly greater amount of resources than expected. So expect spending cuts if we're losing this income tax revenue.
Especially since the expectation, when I asked Representative Adam Matthews on the show last week about an increase in another tax, an increase in the sales tax, a new tax somewhere, that's not part of the plan. So it would stand to reason that you have to make it up somewhere.
Exactly, right. Our balanced budget that is required in our Constitution, we can't rely on deficit spending like the federal government does at times. So we're really looking at budget cuts as a way to balance that budget if we're cutting, again, 40 to 45% of our state tax revenue.
So when critics look at this and they point to Kansas, for instance, as a state that dramatically cut its income taxes in 2012 and blew such a hole in the state budget that Republican lawmakers came back and raised taxes and even overrode a veto from Governor Sam Brownback. So the sponsors say, don't look at that necessarily. They think North Carolina is a better model for what Ohio could do. Is there a comparison here? Is the Kansas model a predictor of what could happen in Ohio, or is North Carolina, is it working there?
Well, I'm more familiar with the Kansas case model as opposed to North Carolina, where I do know that North Carolina has been cutting their income tax as well. However, cutting our income tax and shifting the tax burden again to lower income Ohioans through the sales tax, which is most likely what is going to happen, is not a tax system that we should have to operate and fund the services that we need on the state level. Kansas cut their income tax dramatically. They cut business income dramatically. Sponsors of this legislation say that we're going to get it right because it's more protracted, it's done over a longer period of time, but the state has been cutting the income tax for the better part of 2 decades, and we haven't seen a great major economic boom that is said to be coming with these tax cuts. So I'd be concerned, even though the cuts are more protracted, to play out over a long period of time, we're still not seeing economic activity that is said to be coming from these tax cuts.
And that's a Republican talking point going back a ways, that if you cut taxes, there will be more economic activity and kind of trickle down economics. Has that worked?
Not from the way that we've seen it. In the last 2 decades, as I said, when Ohio really started to cut our income tax in 2005, a lot of economic factors show we're still trailing behind the United States averages in quite a number of factors. So job creation, for one, has only been growing by about 4% since 2005. The United States has seen job growth in that same time period 4 times the rate at 16%. Household income has only grown about 6% in the state since 2005, whereas the United States has doubled about 12%. We're not really seeing what is supposed to happen from these tax cuts, so let's instead reverse that trend. Let's start investing back in our communities, investing in the spending that the state is taking in education, in healthcare, environment, to make the state a place where people want to live and can invest in themselves and their families.
Quite often, the supporters of this idea will point to Florida and Texas as states where they don't have income tax and things are going pretty well. Florida and Texas have tourism and energy as big resources. And the suggestion from Representative Matthews last week was that Ohio could do better on tourism, and we have this huge opportunity with energy in the state. Is there enough potentially to plug that hole? Is there enough energy options here that you see that could bring that back?
I don't see energy on the same level as Texas with their oil boom and their solar production. We have natural gas as a solid resource here, but our severance taxes rates are very low. The last time we tried to raise them in the mid-2010s, which was a Governor Kasich idea, again, to offset cuts in the income tax, the natural gas lobby pushed back on that idea. Very influential here. I'd love to see an increase in the severance tax, but tourism, I would love to, again, to compare and compete against Florida, but nice weather, many beaches, Disney World, that's pretty hard to compete against. And let's not forget that in those states, in Texas and Florida in particular, without the income tax, very high reliance on the sales tax. It's very regressive, and in those states, you're having the lowest earning residents of those states paying an effective tax rate that's in the double digits, whereas the wealthiest earners are paying around 2% or less.
So it really does hit low-income earners a lot more seriously. I mean, certainly the point can be made that wealthier people pay more in taxes, but I think the point that has been made here is that lower-income people pay more as a percentage of their overall income.
Right. The wealthy can pay an absolute number that is greater than lower earning individuals, but again, looking at a share of income, especially when you're considering the sales tax, about where low-income earners are paying a great amount of their income towards, oftentimes in the double digits, 10% or higher of their income, is going towards the sales tax. So this idea that low-income earners don't pay taxes is a myth, and they really do pay a great share of their income in taxes.
And Policy Matters Ohio's research over the decade or so since these income tax cuts have been coming down is that the wealthy have benefited.
Yes, and that's the main takeaway from these tax cuts over these last, again, 2 decades in the state. the wealthiest earning Ohioans, those who make about the top 1% who make about $1.5 million, have seen a tax cut of about $50,000 in total since 2005. They're the ones who are benefiting from this, not the lowest earning Ohioans here.
One of the questions that I think a lot of people are wondering about is if indeed these cuts come, will local communities have to bear the brunt of it? Will they get the big cuts? Is this potentially a way to, as you mentioned at the top of the interview, shifting the taxes down to local communities so state lawmakers can take credit for cutting taxes while local communities have to raise them?
That's again something we'll have to look at. The local government revenue fund, the local government fund would take a great hit. And the state's ability to provide additional resources would take a hit from that lost revenue. So again, states would have to or localities would have to make up a larger share of the services without a larger increase in tax revenue or share of that tax revenue coming back towards them to make their jobs a bit easier.
So the folks who are talking about this are talking about how Ohio has lost members of Congress. People have Ohio gained population, but not nearly enough to keep up with other states that gained population in larger numbers. So what can be done to help Ohio get back on an upward track? They say this is what can be done. What are the options?
Well, we've been losing, as you said, losing population for quite a while. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's been done over this period where we've been cutting taxes. In that time period, we're cutting services. We have one of the lowest worst rates of maternal mortality in the states. So really, we should look at ways to make public services more attractive and available for people to entice them to, one, want to live here and raise a family here and bring other people in here from across the country. So looking at ways to improve those maternal mortality rates, better funding for education to improve our schools as an option, as a competitive option to have people come in and want to raise their family here, and again, lowering that tax burden for middle and working class families, so it's possible for them to have a solid life, a good foundation here to raise their families.
It's a hard sell against the argument of we're going to put more taxes, more money back in your pocket so you can spend the tax money better than the government can.
Well, really, I mean, it's putting a slight bit of money back into middle class Ohioans, but again, they're probably paying that right back if there's a sales tax increase. So putting money back into their pockets is kind of a misnomer when they have to offset that with additional tax revenue, tax spending in other areas, or losses in services.
So I guess you're going to be watching this for what could potentially happen. Where do you think this is going?
We'll see if there's any life for this in this current legislative session. Personally, my biggest concern is this legislation being a starting point for the budget discussions next year. It's probably in a lot of lawmakers' minds to further cut the income tax, as we've done almost since every budget cycle since '05. So really making sure that this proposal doesn't go through this legislative cycle and ensuring that it doesn't make its way into the budget next year. And
of course, you mentioned that there could be property tax reforms coming along here. That just complicates the situation even potentially more.
It really does. While the state isn't the main collector of that property tax revenue, it's mostly counties and other localities. Many across the state are looking towards the legislature for a potential fix towards an increase in property evaluations that have increased assessments and property tax bills for certain individuals. So there's probably going to be some form of property tax relief coming out in the legislature this year, which, as you said, it complicates the calculus sort of when we're trying to rely on property tax, sales tax, and income tax, making sure we strike a healthy balance between all three.
And of course, schools are a big part of the property tax issue and trying to figure out how to make sure that schools are appropriately funded.
Right, make sure they're held harmless to whatever tax revenue losses that they face from any type of property tax relief. It's imperative that the schools don't lose any type of funding to ensure that the students are getting the quality education that they deserve.
Is there a concern about the cut in the commercial activity tax, where the last budget took it basically to 90% of Ohio businesses don't pay that, which used to be the state's main business tax?
Right, exactly. So my main concern with this cut, as they've been cutting it again for the last 2 decades, is how is this cut supposed to stimulate small business growth? They're already excluding, believe up to $3 million in business income through the CAT tax. How is that, excluding that amount of income, stimulating small business growth, which is one of the main drivers of economic activity, one of the main job creators. I don't think this tax, eliminating it or eroding it any further, is doing much for those small businesses. It's just a handout for wealthier companies.
There is already a tax loophole, so to speak, which is what I think you folks have referred to it. The first $250,000 of income is tax-free for those small businesses.
Exactly, yes, the LLC loophole. That starts at $250,000, but from this recent budget bill starting this year, that number jumps to $3 million, and next it jumps up all the way up to $6 million. I don't know very many small businesses that have $6 million in business income a year.
You can watch my interview with Representative Adam Matthews in our archives.